everybody. Oh my gosh, it's been a hot minute since I've been on, and I wanted to come on today because I really have something top of mind. Does diagnosis matter? I guess I am in a minority on this one. It's just interesting, right? Diagnosis. And when we think about our diagnoses, right, a lot of times I hear that people don't want to pigeonhole, especially children, pediatric mental health disorders. They don't want to stigmatize. I hear like once it goes on their chart, their record's going to be there forever. All of this, we just don't want them to be judged or to internalize that diagnosis and make it, so they could, or have it be like this catastrophe type of thing, right? And I just have a different opinion on this one, and I'm just going to throw this out there. Oh, thank you, Jesse. I think diagnosis matters, and I think especially for our children, diagnosis matters. No, we don't want to give them a mental health diagnosis that's inaccurate, and no, we want to make sure that we do our due diligence and we vet that diagnosis properly. But what I see and what I've experienced in my own journey with my children's mental health and watching other parents and what they're experiencing is this hesitation for diagnosis, especially when they're young, especially when it's something quote unquote more serious, right? Like a serious, a mental illness. And I can understand why we wouldn't want to hesitate and throw a diagnosis on there. We want to kind of watch and see what happens. But the flip side of that coin is that diagnosis opens a door and it provides framework for the teams to be able to do what they need to do and for the parent to be able to provide interventions in a way that are really effective. If we are not treating the neurobiological piece of mental illness with the right medications and the right framework with the right interventions, what happens is it elongates that destabilizing situation, that crisis, that escalation, whatever that looks like, right? If we don't have the proper information, we don't have the proper education, then we're just trying to do our best, right? And we would never ask anybody who had a medical illness, and I'll use diabetes as the example here. We would never say to anybody with diabetes, like, okay, we're going to provide you insulin, we're going to prescribe you insulin, but we're not going to tell you you're diabetic. That's ludicrous. You never hear that. You never hear that. But yet in mental health, we hear it all the time. We don't want this kid to be stigmatized and pigeonholed. Well, who's doing the stigmatizing? Who is the one then that is going to stigmatize? I mean, is it other medical health professionals? Well, that to me sounds like a huge learning opportunity, right? We know stigma is a problem and it's systemic. It happens from the insurance providers making policy. It happens so much with medical staff, teachers, police officers. I mean, it's there. Stigma is there, but the only way to fight stigma is with the truth, right? We fight it with education, and we fight it by talking about these things, right? I mean, manic depression, right? What they called it back in the day. I mean, it did feel like a death sentence, but we have come a long way. And now we look at bipolar disorder, and we know that early interventions are critical, but yet we're not diagnosing. And I understand if we can treat it without giving the diagnosis, that's great. But here's the scenario that I want to run through. And, I want to hear, drop your comments in here. I want to hear, I see some therapists in here. I see some medical professionals in here. I see some other parents in here. Let's really have a conversation about this, right? I mean, so let's run the scenario. We have a kid, and the kid has all these exhibiting behaviors. We get this kid on meds. The kid calms down. Fantastic. The kid stabilizes. Well, then as time goes on, let's say this child goes to college, maybe a doctor's going, well, why are you on these mood stabilizers? Let's go ahead and pull you off. You don't have a bipolar diagnosis. You don't need to be on this medication. They pull that person off and that person destabilizes, right? Because now they don't have any weight. They don't have any base. They don't have that diagnosis. That diagnosis allows conversations to happen, right? Like, oh, I don't want to go off my mood stabilizer. I'm bipolar, and I know that's part of what, part of a treatment plan that I have, or, what that really entails, right? It opens doors for children to get accommodations that they need, right? When I had those diagnoses in place, I was able to get my daughter accommodations and an IEP. So I was able to get my child the educational interventions that they needed because of that diagnosis. Diagnosis does matter. As much as we don't want to misdiagnose, I think really seasoned clinicians and therapists know how to vet information or be able to refer to somebody that can make that diagnosis, right? But when we look at, epilepsy, seizing in the brain, right? We don't just say, oh, we're going to treat it with the medication, but we're not going to call it epilepsy because we don't want your driver's license to be taken away. Well, what if this person's having grand mal seizures? Maybe they should not be driving, right? And I think it just matters. We have to start calling a spade a spade. And I understand there's been a huge argument about overdiagnosing and underdiagnosing, and now every kid has ADHD. And is this really trauma? And a lot of things present the same behaviorally, and I get that. But I think there are certain markers that we can look at, and there's certain things in the DSM that we can refer to see if they start kind of checking off boxes, looking at personality disorders, mood disorders, all of that good stuff. Being sad is not being depressed, being stressed out is not being anxious. But when we're looking at diagnoses that really do need some kind of a medical intervention that need meds, people aren't getting access to them because they don't have diagnoses. And this is when it becomes problematic. It's not just about the now, it's also about the later. How do we set, how do I set, as a parent, how do I set my children up for success? I've had to fight for diagnoses, which seems really counterintuitive. But because of this, we don't want to stigmatize your child. You're letting then stigma be more important than the access to the care that my child needs. If somebody's going to be stigmatizing my child, it's only the providers that are reading her chart, right? Or the insurance companies. Maybe that's the concern. Maybe that's the greater concern. But that makes me sad as an individual to know that the insurance companies have the first right of refusal for care for my child. And we all know that they do. So, it's really hard. And I understand it's a hard line for mental health professionals to walk. But these diagnoses, for me, they matter because they open doors. I know how then I know then kind of the parameters that I'm working in as a parent. And if I'm parenting a child with bipolar, or I'm parenting a child with ADHD, which I am, both, right? I have to treat both of those diagnoses differently, and I'm going to have different interventions for those diagnoses and different skills that I'm going to support my children working on and developing with those different diagnoses. But if I don't know what I'm doing, how am I supposed to then be a care provider, which parents often are in our behavioral health system? We're kind of the first line of defense. We're the ones that are trying to teach them the skills and get them to apply what they're learning in therapy and making sure that they're taking their meds and walking them through that journey. And if we don't have a diagnosis, and how can we go educate ourselves so we're helping our child, right? There's too many things that get left behind, and there's too many problems that happen when children don't get the diagnoses that they need, right? And quite often they end up in our criminal justice system, and adults too, right? We see people that are, having psychotic, episodes on the street, and the cops get called and they strike that cop because they're in a psychotic episode, and then now they're in the criminal justice system, and now prison is the new, mental health hospital. And these are the outcomes that we're setting our children up for. We have to understand that we now know so much more than we did 20 years ago about these diagnoses. And if we frame it as parents with our children, like, look, this is not a problem, it's just a neurobiological disorder that you have in your brain, cool, let's get it treated and let's help you navigate this, just like I would if you had diabetes, just like I would if you had cancer, just like I would if you had epilepsy, just like I would if you had arthritis. I would guide you and help you as a parent, but if I don't know how to do that, because certain, mental health diagnoses, there are certain like behaviors that crop up because of those diagnoses, and if I don't have framework, I may be shooting off the mark. And I know for a fact that not having a solid level of attunement and understanding to my daughter's ADHD diagnosis was a huge piece in exacerbating her psychiatric crisis. And I own that as a parent. I didn't understand the diagnosis because I didn't have it, right? I had to fight for that. And then all my interventions were totally off the mark because they weren't really geared to help an ADHD brain. And then it broke the relationship I had with my daughter, her ability to trust in me, my level of being attuned into what she needed, right? All of those things were sacrificed. There are huge outcomes and sacrifices that are made when us as parents don't have all the right information and can't access the care that we need for our child. It shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't. We should be able to have these conversations. We should be able to talk about this. Yes, we want to treat the behaviors, but when we're looking at like SMI, and when we're looking at severe mental illness, you got to treat the schizophrenia, right? You have to get that medicated to get the brain to quiet down enough so treatment can be effective, right? It's not a death sentence. It is up to us as a society to frame it that way. It's just a neurobiological disorder. We have to start treating mental health that way. We can't let stigma dictate how we get treatment. And that starts with mental health professionals. That starts with conversations with them going, well, what's really the problem with this diagnosis? Why would you think it would be stigmatized, right? Why do I have to fight for this, right? Yes, diagnosis guides treatment in school, legally, and with medication. Absolutely, Alicia, like that's, yes, right? Terrified of my son turning to self-medication if we didn't do something now. Yes, absolutely. That's why you see very high addiction rates, especially with people with bipolar. They self-medicate. They do not know how to shut their brains off. And it's usually alcohol. There's a high addiction factor there because it's the only thing that quiets it down, right? And they're led by us. We have to be their advocates. And there's going to be a lot of people who are not going to like what I have to say. And there are going to be a lot of people that disagree with me. It's okay. We can agree to disagree. But what the science is now showing us and the research is now showing us is that the earlier we can intervene, especially when we're thinking about these neurological disorders, right? The better the long-term outcome is for our kiddos. I cannot imagine my life right now if both my children were not properly medicated. Can't. It would be in complete chaos. Medication saved my daughter's life. Now, side effects being what they will, and that's a whole other thing, natural and blah, 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 blah. I'm totally not going to go down that rabbit hole tonight. But I know for me and my experience, the medications that they got prescribed were a direct effect of finally getting the diagnoses they had and the treatment they needed. And that came at a huge price of arguing with, psychiatric nurses and hearing that my daughter was a criminal and all that stuff, right? I was very lucky that my oldest daughter got diagnosed so young, that we had the right teams in place that were able to see it, and they watched it for 2 years. Finally, we got that bipolar diagnosis at age 7. We were able to medicate it with a mood stabilizer. And I will never forget her second grade teacher contacted me and said, I don't know what happened, but it's like a totally different child is in my classroom. And that was day 3 into her new med regime. Her teacher was floored, and she said, and so I told her what happened, and she was like, she couldn't even fathom that. I mean, like, it really was huge for her to experience that as an educator, to see that. Like, when we properly medicate, properly diagnose, and properly treat something, magic happens. And these kids finally get a chance to be able to be who they are, right? To be able to show up how they want to show up in their lives instead of being trapped in a disorder that is causing this behavior that's harmful, disruptive, and hurtful. They're not bad kids. We have a bad system. And we need to start looking at how we view mental health, how we view diagnoses, and why they matter. Yes, treat the behaviors. But I would never tell somebody to try to think themselves out of their diabetes. Never would. And I'm sure a doctor would never just prescribe insulin without that diagnosis. These are important. They are. And it's not because we need to label everything. It's not because we need to have to pigeonhole it, although as humans we typically do. But we need framework and guidance. Know this, it took 11 years to get someone to test and diagnose my son. 11 years. He had to struggle as long as he did. We are letting our children, we're just leaving them hanging. We're fucking up, right? We're the adults in the room. We're fucking up. We have to be able to challenge our own paradigm. We have to be able to ask questions and have conversations like these, right? And really look at the bigger picture, because ultimately our kiddos are paying the price, right? They're not getting the help they need, right? It's actually their hands were tied in helping those with mental illness. Yeah, community mental health providers are strapped. I mean, they're strapped. They don't have a lot of funding, but they also have a lot of people just coming out of school and don't have the depth of experience. And that's a problem too, is how do we get really good information down to the community healthcare level, right? So then the people that are on the front lines dealing with these severe cases are really equipped, armed, and educated. And they kind of know what's going on, right? I know I've seen multiple sides of various coins, and I used to buy into this. If I can just get the behavior, treat the behavior, then I do. But after everything that I went through with Ella, there's no way. Not having those diagnoses mattered. And once we got her on her ADHD medication and her mood stabilizer, wow, my house became so much more peaceful. And then I could show up and parent in the way that I wanted to parent. I couldn't be the parent I wanted to be. And that's its own guilt and shame cycle, right? Yes, some things look like some things and present in some ways. And some ways, and clinicians and therapists, my hat's off to you, there are fine lines, especially around trauma and how trauma presents. But that's why we have the DSM as a guiding tool to start to give shape to a bigger picture, right? People just don't get depression diagnoses. You kind of have to earn it. You kind of have to like check off some boxes for a while and have that behavior be, impacting your function over an elongated period of time. It's not I had a sad day, right? So anyway, I just wanted to go on here. I love all these comments. I mean, I love this, right? I mean, we're kind of in this together. I love this. Worked at a community college questioning their diagnosis. Absolutely, because it was well managed with drugs. That's right. That's why people get on medication to help them deal with the symptoms, right? And then we pull them off their medication. Or even scarier, they think they're stabilized enough to come off their medications in some cases. And that there's a term for that, when it's you think that you're well enough to come off your meds, but you're not, but you think you are, so you take yourself off and then you spiral out of control, and I can't remember the term, but there's actually a clinical term for that, right? I just wanted to come on here and kind of just talk about that really fast, because I think these are conversations that need to happen. Because if we're not giving people the proper diagnosis because we're worried that they're going to be pigeonholed and stigmatized, Well, who's doing that, right? If something's wrong, let's just call it out. And if we're wrong, cool. Let's be wrong about the diagnosis, but treat it as such. Let's just call it out there. Okay, well, maybe, we thought he was bipolar and not bipolar, and okay, well, we were wrong, so let's get that, let's reverse course. It's okay to do that too, right? But what if we're right? And what if the diagnosis is the diagnosis? And then we start getting somebody treatment. It shifts everything. Not just for the person who's affected, but for every person in that person's life. Colleagues, classmates, bosses, partners, spouses, parents, extended family, friends. Real magic can happen there, right? So trial and error often works. That's kind of how I run my life, trial and error. So, right? Let it go. No one's to blame. Absolutely, Karen. No guilt and shame train here. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and jump off now because it's dinner time. But I want this conversation to happen. I really do. I feel like it's a super important conversation, and I want that conversation to happen from the clinical side of the house and the personal side of the house, because I think there's storytelling to be happening in this space for a better understanding on both sides of what that looks like. What is the impact of parents when we don't get the diagnosis? Why is there a hesitation on that clinical side? Maybe there's something that I'm not aware of that I should be thinking about, right? So let's have that dialogue. Of course, as always, check out the podcast, www.beingunnormal.com/podcast, and on all podcast players. I'm on, like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc., etc. I am found for your listening pleasure in most places online. So I love you all. Continue to have this conversation. Drop comments if you're watching this, and I'll see you all on the flippy floppy. Bye, everyone.